Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're kicking off something pretty significant, a whole series actually. We're laying the groundwork for Mentalization-Based Treatment, or MBT. It's a really well-researched, effective therapy model. So if you're maybe getting ready for MBT yourself, or perhaps you're a clinician wanting a clearer picture, or even if you're just curious about how people gain better emotional control, well, this is definitely for you. This is your starting point. Right, so today's mission is really foundation. We're basically going to map out the entire preparatory phase. It's often called MBT-i. Think of it like the essential 11-session training manual you go through before the really intensive therapy starts. Important note, we are not covering session 1 in detail today. Nope. Today is about the big picture, the whole roadmap, so you know exactly what kind of tools you'll be getting along the way. Okay, let's unpack this. Why? Why this quite long 11-session prep track? What's the real goal here? Why can't people just, jump straight into the main therapy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what's really fascinating here is that the main goal of MBT isn't just about changing behavior, it goes deeper. It's really about cognitive change, relational change. The whole aim is to seriously boost your ability to mentalize.
Mentalize, meaning?
Meaning understanding thoughts, feelings, intentions, both your own and those of other people. Especially, and this is key, especially when you're feeling really stressed or emotionally charged up. So this MBTI curriculum, this prep phase, it's absolutely necessary. It's not optional padding. It gives you the concepts, the language, the basic understanding of how emotional breakdown actually works, what's happening inside.
Yeah.
Without that shared knowledge, honestly, the group therapy sessions that come later just wouldn't land. They wouldn't be effective.
Ah, okay. So it's not just showing up and talking about your week. It's like learning a specific language first, a language focused on what's underneath, the problems, the motivations, the inner experience.
Precisely. You've got it. And the ultimate payoff, the real benefit this preparation gives you is resilience. It's the ability to keep that mentalizing skill switched on even when relationship pressure gets intense. It helps you massively cut down the time it takes to recover when you feel overwhelmed, that moment where your brain just feels like it's short circuit.
That shutdown moment.
Exactly. And it helps you handle conflicts, even really deep ones, not just better, but with genuine curiosity instead of just reacting defensively straight away. And just to be clear, everything we're discussing today and in the rest of the series, it's all drawn directly from, established clinical publications, the official materials on MBT principles. So before we really zoom into those 11 sessions, it's helpful to see let's say, the grand architecture of the whole MBT program. It's quite structured. This isn't a quick fix. It's a phased approach, needs real commitment, and it's generally built across 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is what we're focusing on today conceptually, the preparation track, or MBTI. This usually takes about 3, maybe 4 months, and it's not just classes. It's what they call multimodal. So alongside the core 11 sessions we'll map out, there are these mandatory supportive bits. Typically, you'll have a one-off consult with a psychiatrist. That's mainly to look at medication, overall stability, that sort of thing. Then you have bi-weekly individual therapy. But importantly, this isn't your standard, explore your childhood therapy. It's very focused. The goal is working together to create a really clear shared treatment plan. What are we actually working towards?
Right, goal-oriented.
Exactly. And then there's also crucial biweekly work with a sociotherapist.
Sociotherapists, what do they handle?
They look at your practical situation, your social circumstances, housing, job stability, things like that. And critically, they help you set up a solid, workable crisis plan. What do you do when things get really tough? The whole point of this prep track is to stabilize you and give you the thinking tools before you enter the, frankly, quite emotionally intense group setting later on.
That makes a lot of sense. That stabilization and planning, it feels vital. It seems like it acknowledges that jumping into deep group work without a safety net, without a crisis plan, could actually backfire.
Absolutely, it could. So once that foundation feels solid, then you move into phase 2. Clinically, this is known as the main track. This is where the bulk of the therapeutic work happens. It can last quite a while, up to a maximum of 18 months.
Wow, 18 months.
Yeah, it's a commitment. And the intensity really ramps up here. You continue with weekly individual therapy, but the real engine room is the group psychotherapy. Depending on the specific program, that could be anywhere from once a week up to, in some very intensive settings, 6 times a week.
6 times. That's almost daily.
It can be, yes. And alongside that core work, you might also access optional modules, things tailored to your needs, like creative therapy or perhaps writing therapy.
Okay, so you do the intensive work.
Yeah.
Then what? How do you kind of bring it back into normal life?
That brings us perfectly to the third phase, the aftercare track. This also has a maximum duration, again, 18 months. And it's the really crucial step-down phase. The frequency of contact gradually reduces, slowly. But the support systems, they're still there, still available. The main goal here isn't really therapy anymore, it's integration. It's about helping you fully embed those mentalizing skills, generalize them, make them work in your everyday life without needing the constant structure of the main program.
It really is a marathon, not a sprint, that structure. And, one of the things that jumps out immediately, something that feels quite different from maybe other kinds of help, is this core philosophy about not giving simple solutions.
That's right. That's a fundamental tenet of MBT. It explicitly focuses less on giving you specific tips or advice or step-by-step instructions. The philosophical heart of it is this. Once your own capacity to mentalize improves, once you can really understand the dance between motivation, emotion, and behavior in yourself and others, then you become equipped to find your own solutions. The therapist isn't there to be a life coach handing out answers. Their role is to help you understand. It's about fostering autonomy, not creating dependence.
And that focus on autonomy, on finding your own way, seems to underpin some pretty strict behavioral guidelines for the main track group work. These are mentioned in the Session 8 materials, I believe. They really show how central relationships are in this whole process. For instance, while the group members decide what they talk about,
They have autonomy there.
there's this very strong recommendation, almost a rule, against any contact between group members outside of the therapy sessions. Why is that so strict?
Yeah, it sounds strict, but the clinical reasoning is absolutely central to keeping the therapy group safe and effective. It's about maintaining therapeutic integrity. Think about it. If people start forming little alliances or cliques outside the room,
Huh?
or if conflicts brew up privately between sessions, it completely undermines the safety and the openness you need inside the group to do the work. The therapy actually needs the difficult stuff, the conflict, the misunderstandings, to happen in the room where it can be slowed down, looked at, mentalized about by everyone together. Private contact just creates secrets, divisions, unspoken tensions. It poisons the environment you need for honest work.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there's the really fascinating one, the absolute prohibition on intimate or romantic relationships between group members. If that happens, they actually have to move to a different therapy.
You mentioned the clinical reason given is that falling in love inhibits mentalization. Can you unpack that a bit more? It sounds quite dramatic. It does sound dramatic, doesn't it? But it's profoundly accurate within the clinical context of MBT. See, mentalization requires certain things: curiosity, accepting uncertainty, the ability to step back and reflect. When someone is in that highly charged emotional state of new romance, intense infatuation, well, think about what happens. Your prefrontal cortex, the thinking, reflecting part of your brain, it kind of gets temporarily hijacked by the limbic system, the emotional centers.
You're not exactly thinking logically.
Not at all. You're operating on emotional certainty. This is perfect.
Yeah.
Idealization, they're amazing. Intense need. That state actively prevents the kind of careful, curious reflection about yourself and your partner that's needed for the deep therapeutic work MBT aims for. If you can't mentalize about your partner, you certainly can't use the group effectively to learn about relationships. So the therapy itself just stalls. It grinds to a halt. It's really an intellectual or a process necessity, not some kind of moral judgment on romance.
That context is incredibly helpful. So if intense emotional certainty, whether it's, rage or romance, basically short circuits the clear thinking needed for mentalizing, well, then we really need to understand the kinds of psychological challenges where those short circuits are a constant everyday risk.
Exactly. And while MBT can help a wide range of people who struggle with severe emotional dysregulation, it was initially developed for, and is still most commonly used with, individuals diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or BPD. The Session 7 materials define a personality disorder generally as these long-term, consistent, pervasive patterns in 4 main areas: how you think, how you feel, how you behave, and how you relate to others. And crucially, these patterns cause significant ongoing distress or major problems in life: self-management, relationships, work, school, family.
And it's really important to stress, isn't it, that we're talking about specific problematic traits or patterns, not that the entire person is somehow fundamentally flawed or that it's impossible to change.
Precisely. That's a vital distinction. The condition isn't fixed. It's not a life sentence. While these core traits define the struggle, the actual symptoms often soften quite significantly over time, especially with focused treatment like MBT. However, they do tend to predictably spike. They become much more acute when stress levels go up. And understanding where this comes from helps explain that sensitivity to stress. The etiology, the cause, seems to point to this difficult combination.
Nature and nurture again.
Pretty much. You've got potential genetic factors, maybe an inherent sensitivity to emotional pain or higher anxiety levels, or maybe a greater need for external stimulation. That's the nature part. And then that's combined with negative environmental factors, the nurture part. Things like insecure attachment early on, or growing up in an unsafe, maybe non-mentalizing, or highly unpredictable home environment.
So it's like having an engine that's already wired for high sensitivity and then putting it on a road that's full of potholes and unexpected turns.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy, exactly. And this dual vulnerability, you see it play out most dramatically in borderline personality disorder, BPD. So we really need to focus on BPD for a moment because it clearly illustrates the specific mentalization challenges that MBT is designed to target. The characteristics of BPD are absolutely central to understanding why this pre-track training is needed.
Let's elaborate on some of those core characteristics, the ones that make relationships in particular so volatile. First, the relationships themselves tend to be very intense, but also very unstable. This is often driven by something called splitting. Splitting, it's the tendency to see people, including yourself, by the way, in really extreme black or white terms. Someone is either absolutely perfect, a wonderful savior, or they're utterly worthless, a cruel enemy. There's very little room for gray area, for complexity, and that lack of gray area makes complex mentalizing almost impossible.
And underneath that instability, that black and white thinking, there's often a profound sense of fear, isn't there? Absolutely. Often the driving force is this intense, almost paralyzing fear of abandonment. Real or even just perceived abandonment. And this fear leads to these frantic, sometimes desperate attempts to avoid rejection. That might look like begging someone not to leave, making threats, or engaging in really dramatic behavior to try and secure the relationship, only, to maybe push the person away minutes later with anger. It's very confusing for everyone. Other key symptoms include severe identity problems, a sense of self that feels like it's constantly shifting, unstable. Often it kind of mirrors whoever they happen to be close to at that moment.
Like a chameleon effect.
Sort of, yeah. And
Yeah.
high impulsivity is common too, leading to problems with spending, substance use, reckless driving, risky behaviors. We also often see self-destructive behavior, things like self-harm. And it's important to understand this isn't necessarily, attention seeking in a manipulative way. Often it's a highly maladaptive coping mechanism, a way to try and turn unbearable, overwhelming emotional pain into physical pain, which paradoxically can sometimes feel more real or controllable.
Right, trading one kind of pain for another.
Exactly. This is often coupled with this chronic, deep feeling of emptiness inside, like something is fundamentally missing. Then there are the extreme and rapid mood swings, cycling from deep despair to intense euphoria or irritability, sometimes within hours or even minutes. Uncontrollable fits of anger are common too. And finally, when stress becomes completely overwhelming, they might experience temporary paranoia, feeling suspicious or threatened, or dissociation, which is like feeling disconnected from your own body, your thoughts, or reality itself.
Wow. That whole catalog of symptoms, especially the rapid mood cycling, the intensity of the fear, the splitting it, makes it crystal clear why the ability to think clearly under pressure would be the first thing to go. The Session 2 source material seems to confirm exactly this connection. When stress hits a certain point, the capacity to mentalize, to think clearly about motivations, feelings, both yours and theirs, it just shuts down. And those automatic survival mechanisms, the basic fight, flight, or freeze responses, they just take over.
That is precisely the switch point. And for individuals with these kinds of vulnerabilities, their emotional system is just so reactive that this switch point gets triggered much faster and much more intensely than for many other people. It's like their emotional circuit breaker trips with the slightest surge. And the problem with mentalization, as Session 2 highlights, is that when it collapses, it falls into these predictable non-mentalizing patterns.
Okay, so what are those key signs?
Yeah.
How can you tell in the moment that mentalization has stopped, that the switch has flipped?
The preparatory track highlights 4 key indicators to look out for. First, thinking with 100% certainty, being absolutely sure about your own feelings, or especially someone else's feelings or motives. Mentalizing needs curiosity, but certainty just kills it dead.
No room for doubt.
None. Second, engaging in that black and white thinking, we talked about the splitting, all good or all bad. Third, a complete lack of curiosity or empathy. Not wondering why the other person might be acting that way, or even why you feel the way you do. You just react. There's no attempt to understand the internal world. And fourth, allowing overwhelming feelings to lead to a total loss of behavioral control. acting out, saying things you regret, doing impulsive things. And the result. It's that destructive cycle we identified earlier, recurring painful relationship problems, chronic insecurity, emotional instability, and that impulsive behavior.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. That this preparation course, this MBTI, it sounds like it's specifically designed to almost inoculate you against hitting that switch point so quickly or so hard. It gives you the concepts, the map, the basic tools to start recognizing when you're shifting out of that mentalizing state before you're thrown into the deep end of navigating those intense real-time relationship conflicts in the main group therapy.
Exactly. So let's walk through the curriculum now, session by session. This will give you, the listener, that complete overview, that map of the learning journey across these 11 foundational sessions. We can think about it in 3 rough phases.
Okay, phase 1, foundations. We start right at the core, don't we? Session 1, what is mentalization and a mentalizing attitude? And just a reminder, this session 1 is what we'll dive deep into in our very next deep dive.
That's right. So just briefly for our map today. Session 1 defines mentalizing as this ability, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, to understand behavior, yours and others, in terms of underlying mental states. What are the thoughts, feelings, desires, intentions driving the behavior? It's the ability to hold in your mind the idea that our actions spring from our internal experiences. The session material breaks this down into 4 really critical dimensions that need to be kind of balanced for healthy reflection.
4 dimensions.
Yeah. First, balancing conscious and unconscious reflection. We need awareness of our immediate thoughts, sure, but also openness to maybe deeper, less obvious motivations. Second, balancing focus on the self and the other. Too much focus on yourself can lead to narcissism. Too much focus on the other, you lose yourself. Third, and this is crucial, balancing thinking and feeling. The ability to keep thinking, keep reflecting, even when you're feeling really intense emotions. Often when stressed, people sacrifice thinking for feeling.
Right, the feeling just takes over.
Completely. And fourth, balancing looking at the external world, things you can see, like body language, actions, and the internal world, the hidden thoughts, feelings, desires.
It sounds like the attitude you bring is just as important as the skill itself, this mentalizing attitude.
Absolutely. It's fundamental. You could call it intellectual humility applied to relationships. It's characterized by a deep sense of curiosity about yourself and others, an openness to different possibilities, different explanations. It involves taking a persistent, non-judgmental stance, and crucially, acknowledging that you can never be 100% certain about what's going on inside another person's head, or even your own sometimes. When you adopt that attitude, that rigid certainty that fuels so much conflict just starts to soften, to crumble.
Which leads naturally into understanding when that system breaks down, which is session 2, problems with mentalization.
Exactly. Once you know the ideal, you need to be able to spot when it's not happening. So this session focuses on identifying those non-mentalizing signs. Things like using cliches or platitudes to kind of skate over real feelings, or looking for purely external reasons for internal states, like saying, oh, I'm just grumpy because the traffic was bad, instead of exploring, maybe I feel powerless and frustrated and the traffic triggered that feeling. The confusion, the feeling of being misunderstood that often follows those are direct results of non-mentalizing communication.
Okay.
And the key takeaway from session 2 is really learning to manage that stress switch point we talked about. That moment stress hits a certain level and the thinking brain just checks out. Automatic reaction takes over. The source material really emphasizes that while the time it takes to recover from that varies hugely, MBT aims to train you not just to stay mentalizing for longer under pressure, but also, when the switch does inevitably flip, to significantly shorten that recovery time. You start noticing your reactions becoming less intense, maybe less immediate, over the weeks and months.
And we can't really talk about emotions overwhelming our thinking without properly defining what emotions are. That's session 3, emotions and why we have them.
Right. This session gives you a really critical taxonomy, a way of categorizing emotions. It makes a distinction between what we call basic emotions. These are the innate survival-focused ones, the ones you see across cultures, even across mammals, like fear, anger, joy. And then the newer, more complex social emotions, like jealousy, guilt, or shame, which are more tied to our relationships and social rules. But perhaps the most vital distinction session 3 makes, and one that many people find really eye-opening, is the difference between emotions with a capital E and feelings with a capital F.
Emotions versus feelings, how are they different?
Okay, so emotions are the really fast, automatic, often physical reactions happening below conscious awareness. That sudden jolt of adrenaline, the heat rising in your face, your jaw clenching.
The bodily sensations.
Exactly. The body's instantaneous survival response system kicking in, we often don't even notice them consciously until they've already shown up physically. Feelings, on the other hand, are when we become consciously aware of that emotional state. It's when we can recognize it, label it, name it, I'm feeling angry, or this is joy. Mentalizing involves bridging that gap, translating the raw physical emotion into a conscious, understandable feeling that you can think about.
And the material stresses that emotions themselves, these signals, they're never actually right or wrong, are they?
That's the core acceptance piece, absolutely. Each of the basic emotions discussed, I think they focus on about 7, serves a distinct vital function for survival. Interest drives us to explore and learn. Fear protects us from danger. Anger helps us assert ourselves or defend boundaries. Even things like sadness or separation anxiety, they have an evolutionary function to signal distress and solicit care and support, keeping us connected. So accepting them simply as signals, as information, rather than judging them as good or bad, that's the essential first step towards managing them effectively.
Which brings us to the practical application in session 4. Recognizing and dealing with emotions, often termed emotion regulation.
Yes, this is where the skill building really starts. How do you actually recognize these emotional signals? Well, you learn to look for external cues, facial expressions, tone of voice, body language in other people. And crucially, you learn to tune into the internal cues within yourself. Those specific physical body signals, the knot in your stomach, your heart racing, maybe suddenly feeling lightheaded or your knees knocking, becoming aware of your own body's signals. And a really fascinating part of this session is the discussion around mirror neurons.
Ah, yeah, I've heard of those.
Right. These are brain cells that fire both when you do an action and when you just watch someone else do that same action. This mechanism is thought to be partly why we can catch feelings from others, why we might suddenly feel anxious just being around someone anxious, or feel excited when they are. Now, while that's incredibly useful for instant empathy, it also creates a critical challenge for mentalizing. You have to pause and check, is this intense feeling I'm experiencing right now genuinely mine, rooted in my own situation? Or have I just absorbed it, like emotional contagion from the person I'm interacting with? That requires mentalizing.
And the goal here isn't to squash your emotions or become a robot, right?
Yeah.
It's about finding a balance.
Yeah, precisely. Regulation isn't suppression. Trying to ignore or bottle up emotions inevitably leads to them bursting out later, often in much bigger, more destructive ways. Regulation is about understanding your emotions and managing them so they stay intense enough to guide you, to give you information, but not so overwhelming that they trip that switch point and shut down your thinking. When this regulation fails consistently, that's when we encounter what the source material calls ungementalized emoties, basically, unprocessed or non-mentalized emotions. These are the feelings that become so overwhelming, so painful, maybe so unbearable, that they completely bypass the thinking mind and just provoke these immediate, often destructive escape behaviors.
Can you give some examples of those destructive escape behaviors that the therapy aims to help people replace?
Yeah, the source material typically highlights 3 main categories. First, you have self-destructive actions, things like self-harm or maybe suicide attempts. It's like turning that unbearable internal pain into something physical, something potentially more tangible. Second, you have behaviors aimed at just obliterating the feeling altogether, things like excessive drinking, using drugs, maybe binge eating, anything to numb out. And third, you can have these aggressive externalized actions, picking fights, having uncontrollable outbursts of rage. It's like trying to discharge that unbearable internal tension onto the outside world. And the therapy really emphasizes that you have to talk about these patterns, these urges, these behaviors within the safety of the therapy group. Sharing that vulnerability is the first step towards replacing those destructive escapes with a more relational, mentalizing way of coping.
Okay, so after building that foundation on emotions and thinking, the focus seems to shift quite dramatically in phase 2, moving from our internal wiring to our relational wiring. Starting with session 5, the importance of attachment relationships.
Absolutely. Attachment theory is fundamental to MBT. Session 5 defines attachment as that foundational emotional bond, the one that starts with our primary caregivers, usually parents, and profoundly shapes how we approach and behave in all our later close relationships. It's considered a core survival mechanism in humans. The session usually outlines the ideal scenario, what's called the secure cycle. It goes like this. The baby signals distress, cries, fusses. The caregiver notices, responds, tries to figure out the need. They mentalize the baby's state and provides comfort. The baby is soothed and calmed. When this cycle happens consistently, reliably, good enough, as they say, the child internalizes 2 crucial things. A positive image of themselves, my needs matter, my feelings are valid, and a positive image of others. Other people are generally reliable and will help me when I'm distressed. But when that cycle is unreliable, inconsistent, perhaps frightening, that's when insecure attachment styles tend to develop. The session material is usually focused on two main insecure styles that are particularly relevant for understanding difficulties like BPD.
Okay, let's take the first one. What happens if the caregiver was maybe physically present, but just really inconsistent or unpredictable in their responses?
That often leads to what's called the ambivalent attachment style, sometimes called anxious preoccupied. Because the caregiver's response was so unpredictable, sometimes they were there, sometimes they weren't, sometimes they were warm, sometimes rejecting the child learns, essentially, to ramp up their distress signals. They exaggerate their emotions, make them bigger, louder, more dramatic.
To try and guarantee a response.
Exactly, to maximize the chances of getting noticed and getting their needs met. As adults, people with this style are often quite anxious about the availability and reliability of their partners. They worry a lot about rejection, find it really hard to soothe themselves when distressed, and tend to be hyper-focused on monitoring the other person for any sign they might be pulling away. You often see this pattern of clinging, alternating with pushing away in anger or frustration. Now, contrast that with the avoidant attachment style, sometimes called dismissive avoidant. This tends to develop when caregivers were consistently rejecting, dismissive of the child's needs, or emotionally unavailable. Here, the child learns a different lesson. Expressing need is pointless or maybe even dangerous. It leads to rejection. So they learn to minimize or suppress their outward displays of emotion. They act as though they don't need others. They value independence very highly.
They seem calm on the outside.
They often appear very calm, self-sufficient, yeah. But crucially, and the source material makes this clear internally, they're often experiencing just as much stress, just as much physiological arousal when attachment figures are unavailable. Their system has just learned to deactivate the external signals of distress. But the really profound and hopeful point Session 5 makes is that these attachment patterns, while deeply ingrained, are learned responses. They are not fixed destiny. They can, and often do, change through new, positive, corrective relational experiences, which is exactly what the MBT group therapy aims to provide a space for.
And Session 6 seems to link these two big concepts directly, attachment and mentalization.
Yes, this session really highlights the two-way link between them. It shows how growing up in a mentalizing environment, a family where people talk openly about motivations, needs, feelings, where different viewpoints are allowed and accepted, where parents avoid presenting their own perspective as the absolute only truth, that kind of environment actively promotes secure attachment in the child. And in turn, having that secure base, feeling safe and understood, that actively boosts the child's developing capacity to mentalize as they grow up. It's a positive feedback loop.
Okay, so secure attachment helps mentalizing, and mentalizing helps secure attachment.
Exactly. But conversely, if a family really struggles with mentalization, perhaps the parents are overwhelmed by their own issues, maybe addiction, severe stress, their own insecure attachment patterns. This can create what's sometimes called an attachment conflict in the child. This is a really difficult, almost tragic internal dynamic where the fundamental biological drive to seek comfort and support from a caregiver clashes with another powerful feeling, usually fear. Fear of being punished, fear of being rejected, fear of retaliation if they show vulnerability.
So the person you need is also the person you fear.
Precisely. And in really extreme situations, like where there's actual violence or abuse in the home, the brain finds it incredibly difficult, sometimes almost impossible, to mentalize about the person causing the fear. Thinking about the abuser's inner world, their motivations, is just too psychologically dangerous. The focus has to be purely on survival.
This whole phase really drives home how our present-day struggles in relationships are so often echoes, reverberations of those earliest attempts to connect and feel safe.
Indeed. And just before moving into the nuts and bolts of the MBT program itself, the final session in this contextual phase is Session 7, What is a Personality Disorder? This serves as a really important kind of structural check-in. It revisits the definition of personality disorders, often focusing back on those core BPD features, the unstable relationships, the identity issues, the impulsivity, the emotional storms. The aim here is to make sure that the learner, the person going into MBT, really deeply understands the why. Why is this intensive treatment necessary? What are the underlying patterns we're trying to address? It solidifies that foundation before getting into the how of the therapy.
Okay, so context established, foundation laid. Now we shift into phase 3, looking at the actual mechanics of the treatment and how it tackles those high-stress states. Starting with Session 8,
Right.
Mentalization-Based Treatment, Part 1.
Right. So session 8 circles back to review the overall goals and that structural framework we discussed, the preparation, main, and aftercare tracks. But the real emphasis here is on the core therapeutic engine, the group. The group environment is presented as the essential relational laboratory. It's the place where you get to practice mentalizing under pressure in the midst of real-time, often quite intimate and challenging relational dynamics with other group members and the therapist.
It's not just theory anymore.
None at all. It's practice. The group is usually facilitated by a therapist who deliberately adopts a curious, inquisitive, not knowing stance. They don't position themselves as the expert with all the answers. Instead, they create and protect a space where members feel encouraged, eventually, to share moments of emotional difficulty, interpersonal misunderstandings, conflicts that arise within the group itself. And the therapist's role isn't to judge who's right or wrong or to solve the conflict. It's to gently guide the group to explore what happened from a mentalizing perspective. Asking things like, what do you imagine might have been going on in Sarah's mind when she said that? Or what were you feeling just before you reacted that way? The goal is always increasing understanding, not assigning blame.
And the relationship between the group member and the therapist, that seems to be really front and center in Session 9, Mentalization-Based Treatment Part 2.
Absolutely. Session 9 delves into the common, often unavoidable difficulties that crop up when trying to form these close, trusting therapeutic bonds. And forming those bonds is pretty essential if you want to get the maximum benefit from the treatment. The session openly addresses common reasons why people might struggle to connect deeply in therapy. Things like the awareness that this relationship is ultimately temporary, the therapy will end eventually, that can be hard to grapple with, or the inherent difficulty in expressing negative feelings like frustration, disappointment, even anger directly towards the people you're relying on for help, like the therapist or other group members.
Yeah, that sounds tricky.
It is. And there's often that intense fear of rejection, which paradoxically can actually get stronger as the bond deepens and feels more important. And then there's the unavoidable asymmetry of disclosure. You, the patient, are sharing deeply personal things, while a therapist, quite appropriately, maintains professional boundaries and shares very little about their own personal life. That imbalance can feel strange sometimes.
Okay, so the session acknowledges these difficulties. How does MBT actually handle them?
MBT therapists are specifically trained to manage these dynamics actively and openly. A core technique involves the therapist deliberately stopping the action in the group, slowing things down, and rewinding to carefully examine what is happening in the here and now, right in that moment, especially focusing on the dynamics between group members or between a member and the therapist. So if someone feels let down or misunderstood or maybe rejected by the therapist or the group, those difficult negative feelings, that's the most important therapeutic material for the session. The source material really stresses that explicitly talking about these feelings and collaboratively mentalizing about them. Why might you feel the therapist let you down? What was your expectation? What might the therapist have been thinking? That's the only way to prevent the treatment from stalling. Because otherwise, the hurt or the anger just festers, or it plays out behaviorally through withdrawal or arguments, and the learning stops.
Right. You have to talk about the relationship in the relationship. Okay, so the final 2 sessions tackle those 2 major high-stress emotional states that consistently seem to knock mentalizing offline, anxiety and depression. Starting with Session 10, anxiety, attachment, and mentalization.
Yes. Session 10 starts by defining anxiety as that basic emotion we discussed, the body's signal of potential threat or danger. It then outlines some common ways anxiety shows up clinically. Things like phobias, those intense, often irrational fears of specific objects or situations. Panic disorder, experiencing sudden, overwhelming surges of physical and mental anxiety, often feeling like you're dying or losing control, sometimes without any obvious external trigger. And agoraphobia, which often develops because of panic attacks, leading to avoidance of public places or situations where escape might be difficult or help unavailable if panic strikes.
Okay, so it defines these disorders. How does it connect them back to attachment and mentalizing?
Crucially, it highlights the link between effective anxiety treatment and attachment. Traditional treatment for anxiety disorders, especially phobias, often involves exposure therapy, gradually confronting the feared stimulus. But research, in the MBT perspective, emphasizes that exposure works best and feels much less terrifying when the person undertaking it feels supported by a secure attachment figure. That could be the therapist, or maybe a trusted group member, someone who provides reassurance, a sense of safety, a secure base they can return to.
So it's like the adult version of a little kid being scared of the dark but feeling braver if they're holding their parent's hand. The therapist or group provides that hand.
Exactly that analogy. It provides the secure base. Therefore, the application within MBT becomes really clear. It's absolutely vital that you try to share your anxieties within the group, even though doing so might feel incredibly difficult. It might trigger feelings of shame or fear of being judged, or fear that others won't understand or won't help. But the group is designed to function as that supportive attachment system. Sharing the anxiety allows the group to offer support, validation, and a sense of shared vulnerability, which directly counteracts the avoidant impulse that anxiety often fuels.
Okay, makes sense. And finally, we arrive at the last session of the prep track, session 11. Depression, attachment, and mentalization.
Right. Session 11 links depression often back to that basic emotion of sadness, particularly sadness related to loss or grief. This could be grief over a relationship breakup, losing a job, maybe moving house, or even unresolved grief from losses earlier in life where there wasn't adequate emotional support at the time. When that normal grief reaction doesn't resolve, when it persists and becomes chronic, it can morph into clinical depression, which is often marked by this kind of emotional rigidity, a loss of pleasure, and pervasive pessimism.
And the session focuses on the thinking patterns in depression.
Yes, it specifically highlights depressive thinking. These are those automatic, rigid, negative thoughts and core beliefs that tend to maintain the depressed state. You know the ones. It will never get any better. I'm completely useless. I'm a burden to everyone. Nothing good ever happens to me. Notice the hallmark lack of curiosity in those statements. The intense 100% certainty. This kind of thinking is really the polar opposite of a mentalizing attitude.
So mentalization offers a way to challenge that rigid negative certainty directly.
Precisely. Mentalization gives you the tools to start questioning those fixed negative convictions. Instead of just accepting, I am useless, as absolute fact, mentalizing encourages questions like, okay, that's a strong feeling, but what's the evidence? Are there times I haven't been useless? What might be another reason I'm feeling this way right now? Could it be exhaustion? Could it be disappointment about something specific rather than a statement about my fundamental worth? It introduces doubt, flexibility, alternative perspectives where depression sees only bleak certainty. And the final point session 11 usually touches on is medication. While antidepressants are common and can be very helpful, the MBT approach often includes a longer-term goal of potentially tapering off medication, always in careful consultation with the prescribing doctor, of course. The clinical thinking behind this is important. Sometimes medication can slightly flatten the emotional range, and for MBT to work most effectively, you actually need access to your full range of emotions, even the difficult ones. You need to be able to feel them to learn how to understand and manage them through mentalizing.
Wow. Okay, we've just walked through the entire 11-session journey of the MBTI preparation track. That's a huge amount of ground covered. We went from the absolute basic, defining mentalization, spotting non-mentalizing moments, all the way through understanding the profound impact of attachment, and finally seeing how MBT approaches those really tough, high-stress emotions like anxiety and depression within that framework. So this whole 11-session blueprint, it really is your comprehensive map to the core ideas, the fundamental principles of MBT. And when you boil it all down, what does this all mean? It seems like the entire foundation of this quite complex therapy rests on one simple yet profoundly challenging idea: developing and committing to this unwavering sense of curiosity. Curiosity about your own inner world and curiosity about the hidden inner worlds of the people around you.
Beautifully put. And perhaps I could leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Think back to the last time you felt really overwhelmed in a disagreement or a conflict with someone important to you. And in that moment of absolute certainty, that feeling where you just knew exactly why they were saying that or why they were trying to hurt you, ask yourself, was that moment of intense clarity truly a sign of deep understanding? Or was it, perhaps, just perhaps, the critical moment when your brain switched off its curiosity and mentalization completely stopped?
That's definitely something to think about.
Our next deep dive in this series will zoom right in. We'll be focusing entirely on session 1. What exactly is mentalizing, and what does it mean to adopt a mentalizing attitude? We'll really unpack those foundational concepts. Thank you for listening.